This series is brought to you by the Headstrong Project, a nonprofit on the front lines of veteran mental health and PTSD treatment. To learn more about how we're helping service members, veterans, and their families triumph over trauma, visit theheadstrongproject.org.
Welcome to CEO Connect. I'm Steve Amsden. I'm a social impact leader and founding member of HirePurpose. Joining me today are Kelly Jones, Chief People Officer at Cisco, a company consistently recognized for its commitment to culture and care, and Jason Phillips, former CEO of Red Cat Systems. He's a trailblazer in people analytics and a passionate advocate for veteran hiring and support. Kelly and Jason, thank you both for being here. Kelly, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe not just your role but why these issues are important to you personally?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you for doing this podcast. I think it's such an important conversation for people to be having. And so I appreciate the partnership and kind of bringing this to life. And I really appreciate the invite. I know I'm here largely because of Jason, who mentioned me as someone who could come and talk about this. Thank you, Jason. But yes, as you mentioned earlier, I'm the Chief People Officer at Cisco. And Cisco is a company that has a deep, as you may know, kind of deep history of supporting our veteran employees for a variety of reasons. And for me, this is a lovely intersection of how we can both support our veterans and this idea of focusing on mental health and well-being, which in an ever changing and ever disruptive world is becoming more and more important. And at Cisco, it's always been a focus for us because we believe that when our employees are well, our business is well and our customers are well. And so these are two topics that are very top of mind for me. And so I just appreciate the opportunity to be here and have this discussion with you both.
Jason, tell us a little bit about your professional life and obviously the work you've done in the military.
A little bit about myself, even though former CEO and a host of different HR leadership roles across some of the amazing brands that are out there, to include Cisco, which is here today. I actually started my career in the Marine Corps, both enlisted and officer. I was a first generation college kid, as we like to say. So I had to figure that out, and figuring that out was a byproduct of the Marine Corps. So tons of learnings, tons of experiences that I'm honored to be able to share throughout this podcast today. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
You've been out of the Marine Corps for quite some time now. And when you think about that transition from military to the civilian life, what do you wish more people in business would understand about that chapter?
First, by saying transitions are hard. Transitions are hard for anyone. It's not even just a military thing or a veteran thing, but I would argue it has a little bit of a little different element of complexity on it. You come from an environment in the military where teams are not only just critical, but teams are foundational. And the proximity, especially if you're in combat arms or in those types of roles in the military, it is very unique. And then you transition to the next day, whether you're working in a remote setting or a hybrid setting, it's just a completely different environment. So recognizing that as an employer or as a people leader, as we like to say, is important. Because how you put team at the forefront and how you allow somebody to acclimate effectively into that environment is something that you can't really sweep it under the rug. Second, I would say that, when you're in the military and you're transitioning out, everything is anchored around leadership and small unit leadership. And that is a completely incredible attribute that is fostered for all veterans. And it is something that is incredibly important for companies that are attracting and wanting to hire and retain that talent. But it's not the only thing. And just for myself, I know I transitioned out assuming I did all these roles and I was an officer and leadership is good enough. And then I completely underestimated this one thing called skills. And employers need skills, right? So the beautiful thing is you come in this transition with a whole lot of leadership and managerial attributes that are critically important and valuable. But don't underestimate the importance of actually the learning and the skills when you make that transition. You have to be willing to take the risk. You have to be willing to step into it and realize that there's going to be a learning and there's going to be a cycle of learning. And you have to be willing to put yourself forward. So there's a little bit of kind of understanding required from the company side, but also from the actual veteran that's transitioning as well.
In your experience, what does it actually look like for a workplace to be veteran ready, and not just on paper, but in practice?
Yeah, I like to say there has to be this element of top-down commitment and grassroots support. And that could be used and copy and pasted across a lot. But in the veteran space, if your leadership team isn't committed to it, it's going to be hard to stay the course. And likely, if your veterans that are there and others that work around and with veterans don't have that support and the grassroots commitment to it, it also makes it a struggle. So, top down commitment, grassroots support is incredibly important. Second, employers have to realize they got to meet the workforce where they're at. And I think it's most people just assume that if I just turn around and move percentage of hiring from 5% to 7%, we've hit the mark. And this is why I love Kelly being here, because you're going to realize Cisco is one of those perfect shining examples of meeting the workforce where it's at. And from a Cisco point of view, it wasn't just hiring, right? There's a whole lot of other elements and spaces to play in to meet that workforce where it's at, whether it's behavioral health, mental health. If you got people that are activated and the spouses are left behind, what's the element of support for that? Can they actually engage and find employment while their spouses are gone? There is a plethora of opportunities, but the companies that do it well have a pulse that's connected and they know where to meet that workforce where it's at and double down to make it effective. And to do that, you've got to have a level of transparency and commitment for the veterans that are there, but you also have to have the commitment from the leadership to be able to stay the course.
We often think of transition as a moment in time, but for a lot of veterans, it's a very long, lengthy process. What helped you find your footing on the civilian side, and what took a little bit longer than you expected?
It is not something that gets figured out in 3 months. And this isn't just a Jason or me thing. I know admirals, generals, colonels that have transitioned out that have this, and corporals that have transitioned out. You have to be willing to stay the course. And there's a couple of key elements. First, you got to be willing to take risks. You got to be willing to take risks. Not every job that you do in the military is 100% translation to an easy fill in the corporate side. So you got to be willing to take risks to put yourself out there, back to the skills and learning. Second, be willing to start at a level that you may think is a little bit lower than you would like and make impact, deliver outcomes. For myself, I went into roles and I had probably a little bit loftier expectation of what I thought my value was when I transitioned out. But I went in anyway. And what I realized is I had a lot of learning to do. And my transition went into consulting when I went out personally on my journey. It was good that the organization said you need to start lower than you want to, because there's learning that needs to come with it. And I did. And 2 years later, I am forever indebted that feedback and transparency was delivered. I think the military does a really good job of delivering confidence to folks while they're in those roles. But the veteran has to realize that when you transition out, it is a different environment. And as I said, the leadership attributes, they're there, but the skills and the learning, it takes time. And you have to be willing to put yourself in that position to stay the course. And you have to be willing to take risk with it. You have to be willing to hear the tough feedback. It's never good to turn around and say, hey, I know you've been in this role for 4 months. This is how you can do it better. That's hard. But when you get it and if you process it, you are so far better from it. So I sum it all up to say, you have to take the risk, take the learnings, be willing to step down a little bit from what you think your role should be when you come out. You'll be better for it in the long run.
A lot of veterans won't come out right out and say they've been struggling during the first year or two after they've transitioned out of the military. From where you sit with your former role as a CEO, what can companies do to create a space for those conversations without really putting anyone on the spot?
Yeah, I'll start on this. Just actually do it. I mean, this is such an easy. This is like a layup, as we like to say in the basketball days here. A lot of companies talk about it. Just do it. To steal Nike's logo there. Create the safe space, right? Create the opportunities. Whether it is safe space within dedicated forums where you come in and you bring veterans together, either remote, hybrid, or live, or you have different digital channels that can be created. Find the mechanism. Find the forums. And just put it in motion, because you'll find that once you do that once or twice, and this is another perfect example where Cisco excels on this. Once you do it once or twice, the muscle will start to get built fast, and then you'll feel more and more transparency is there. That's number one, just do it. Second, the good employers know how to partner well with organizations like we are with today to provide vehicles outside of that work environment if it is needed by that veteran or that veteran community. So it's the partnerships, and it's also just put it in motion and do it. Stop talking about it. Just get it done.
I think what Jason said is so powerful. And it's one of the two of the things that we really try to model at Cisco. And through that, one of the ways we do it is we also try to not have this, hey, we're corporate and we're here to help mentality, but rather listen to the community and understand what it is the community needs. And so with our veterans programs, but with many of the other programs we do in the people space, they're largely built bottom up. They're largely built with listening, sensing, and our people intelligence data that tells us kind of where employees are and what they need in the moment. So that's the only thing I would add to that is, when you listen to your employees and you allow the community to actually be involved in some of the design, you're going to get a much better output.
Yeah. Can I also add one thing to Kelly's one thing? We knew this was going to happen. It just took 6 minutes longer than we thought. What I love about Cisco's journey, most veterans ERO programs tend to be myopically US centric. And when you're myopically US centric, it takes you down a path that is a carbon copy from a lot of others. The beauty of what Cisco did is they stepped back and said, this is a global thing. This isn't necessarily just a US thing or a regional thing within the US. And what you find, back to what Kelly was saying, when you bring them into the design element, you start to find from a global point of view, it takes you down different paths and different roads. And organizations have to be willing to support different paths and different roads. And if Kelly's ERO vets groups were here today, what they need in India or what they need from Germany or what they need from England is probably a little different than what they need from the United States. So the ability to broaden the aperture to bring everybody into a true global community of practice, that is powerful, but it is a galvanizing element for that veterans ERO across Cisco, having been a former participant in it myself.
I've worked with you, Jason, before, and this is a compliment, you're an executionary. You see strategy and then you get it done. You don't overthink. And I remember the work you did at Cisco with vets is you just activated and helped and didn't talk about the issue, but your actions change people. So that's one thing I've witnessed about you, why you're a great leader in the space. And then Kelly, I completely agree about these kind of programs. They have to be authentic and real or else they're not meaningful. And it's a fine line for you as an HR leader to be part of, but you don't want to tell people what to do. You want them to create the story and magic out of it that they want to get. And you're there to just let them feel that magic and support it. I think authenticity and letting the people that are involved build it and you there as a leader to just support their vision is very important and more successful long-term because it's real.
You have done an amazing job in the Cisco team. It's not about the two of us here. It's the people that we've worked with, of cross-pollinating is the word I like to use, EROs. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the takeaways for anybody listening to this, especially if you're a people leader in an organization that has scale, don't do these things in vertical silos, right? Yeah. Kelly, I mean, I would assume you would agree on this. The power in this is having multiple EROs that cut across multiple different groups so that they can plug and play together and learn from each other. There's power in that to serve as a catalyst and an accelerant, honestly.
So if you were sitting down with a room full of business leaders who want to support veterans, but don't know where to start, where would you tell them to start?
Talk to your people. I think Kelly teed that up, and it's absolutely right. This is not something that you do in the cabal of an executive leadership team conference room. The best way to do is, you know who your veterans are. Most people, self-identify when they come in. Pull them together in a very nice, open, transparent environment and say, what can we do to help you? And then eventually it becomes, what can we do together to better serve the business? What can we better do to serve the community? What can we better do to serve our customers? Veterans can play roles in all of this as the rings get built around the concentric circles. But start by bringing them in and putting them at the center of the design. Anywhere I've seen that done, success has followed. When I've seen a small group of people make assumptions on what the strategy and the plan needs to be, usually traction isn't gained.
So I'm excited to have Kelly speak on this subject. Once again, to kind of frame the situation, this podcast is not only about veterans, but about wellness and why supporting your employees is very important to the business and is a strategy in general. Kelly, Cisco was recently named the #2 military-friendly employer in the country. The award reflects a long-term commitment to the military community. From your perspective, what drives that commitment at Cisco, and how does it actually show up in the employee experience day to day?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for us, it's pretty straightforward. When you think about what we're trying to do with our business, things like leadership, resilience, teamwork, this idea of being able to kind of rapidly adapt and innovatively solve problems, which by the way, Jason's a great example of someone who does that. All of these things are critical to the work that we do at Cisco. So for us, it leads naturally to being committed to not just building that bridge for military service, but also helping to create these meaningful careers. And Jason, you touched on this earlier, this idea that it has nothing to do with how many people come in the front door. It's the environment that you create when you're there. It's those things have to kind of happen in equal measure. So for us, it shows up pretty holistically in a few different ways. One is our veteran leadership program. And the way our employees experience this is, we support our veterans transitioning into civilian careers by leveraging some of the unique skills that they might have. And what it really does is help our vets integrate into the workforce and advance their careers. But it goes beyond just how you bring people in, as I mentioned earlier. Jason touched a little bit on some of the mental health resources, and I'll bring that into the conversation a little bit because well-being at Cisco is a big topic for us, as you can imagine. It's one that I've spoke about a lot, and we can draw a direct line between the well-being of our employees to the satisfaction of our customers. And so the story with well-being that I sometimes think people miss is the fact that if you have high well-being, you have high productivity and engagement, you have happy customers. The mantra around well-being is sometimes focused on, we do it because it's a nice thing to do. It is a nice thing to do, but it also is good for business. And so I always try to make sure that I'm bringing this up when companies are thinking about, do they invest in well-being and mental health programs, because they pay back for you. And so it's one of the things that we feel strongly about. And in this space with veterans, you can imagine that even outside of this, we've got a pretty deep well of kind of mental health and well-being resources. But we also have some that are very specific to veterans that kind of recognize some of the unique challenges that they might face, either during or after service. The other thing that we try to double down on is this career development side, career development programs that also help them grow professionally. And this is aligned to kind of the overall commitment we have around continuous learning. But there are some specific programs that we bring to life for our veteran community. But I think the most important thing, Jason, you teed me up perfect for this, is we strive to have a really holistic approach that starts with the recruitment phase, but goes to the onboarding phase, ongoing development and well-being. And when you take this more holistic approach, it makes the commitment much more tangible in the daily experience of our employees.
Cisco has built some incredible career pathways for veterans: SkillBridge fellowships, the Military and Sales Leadership Program, and the Talent Bridge Initiative. Why has Cisco made the kind of investment in veteran talent, and what kind of impact has it made on your workforce and culture?
So what a great question. I get to talk about all these great programs. Thank you for that. This is a great one. So, we've put a lot of effort into kind of creating these career pathways for veterans. And the one you mentioned is one of them. And we do it, it's not that difficult. We do it because we value the leadership and the problem solving skills that, amongst other things, that our veterans bring to the table. And so the programs you mentioned, they kind of help to smooth out the transition from military life into civilian careers. Jason, I think you touched beautifully on, oftentimes transitions are hard regardless of what the transition is, and I love coming into something super confident. Sometimes we don't know how a thing is going to go. And so anything we can do to help with that transition is really important. And we try to do it through things like mentorship, training, networking opportunities that really fit the unique backgrounds of our veterans. And I think you can't discount the sense of community. And you touched on something really important around this concept of the horizontal communities. I think it's really powerful. People need to find a sense of community somewhere in their workforce. And so when we have the ability to do that, it's really important. And the impact of these on our workforce has been really positive. What we see is that our veterans bring really strong dedication, resilience, and teamwork that uplifts the teams that they're in and helps us in terms of how we perform and lead.
In 2024, you launched the Veteran Leadership Program. It's a 6-month development experience for high-performing veteran employees. It was built entirely by volunteers inside Cisco, which is pretty amazing. What inspired the program, and what have you learned from this first cohort that you launched?
Yeah, this shocking, not surprisingly, is not one of the programs that we sat in a room, to use your words, Jason. 3 of us sat in a room and said, let's do this. It actually came from one of our employees. So one of our employees went to the George W. Bush Presidential Center and attended something they had there called Stand to Veteran Leadership Program. and was inspired by it and kind of brought it back and said, we should do something that achieves this outcome, but is very uniquely Cisco. How do we uniquely bring Cisco into this? And so the goal was really to improve outcomes for veterans and their families through developing this professional community. And what we really strove to do in that was combine this unique set of resources and opportunities in the business through really creating this direct proximity to directors and above. So we have executives involved in this program and create this kind of robust agenda that has internal and external speakers. And it really allows our veterans to kind of develop what the future of their leadership style is going to be. Because you likely know this, but a large percentage of vets leave the corporate world in 12 to 18 months after transitioning because sometimes adjustment is difficult. And so creating this idea of like community, connection, leadership development, it creates the environment that really allows for better retention and integration. And the program, we actually launched it last calendar year. It was kind of a first in kind of what we've done at Cisco. And we're getting ready to, our first cohort, I think, wrapped earlier this year. And we learned from that one. At Cisco, we try to take this scientific mindset where we test and learn. We do the thing, we see the outcome, we test and learn. So we spent a lot of time listening to understand how to refine the program. We did that. And then we're partnering. Actually, you mentioned this earlier, Jason, partnerships. For our next cohort, we're partnering with a few areas: Monumental Sports, the Washington Wizards, and Delta Airlines. And we're actually going to have our graduation celebration at the Cap One Stadium at a Wizards game in November, which is really kind of cool. So these partnerships, you mentioned this earlier, Jason, but I think it's so important. Everybody, we try to do our best at Cisco to create this environment, but we're also humble enough to know that we don't know everything. And so it's important to ensure that we're connected with others, like-minded organizations that are really invested in this.
I would kind of define it's like you're driving like a purpose-driven community. It's like, especially with veterans, they really thrive on purpose versus just the day-to-day jobs. You're pulling together all these ideas and folks together. So it's not just about their job, but purpose and kind of making a difference in what they're trying to do day to day.
Cisco's kind of the same way. It's a different mission, but it's this idea of being mission or purpose driven.
Cisco has always prided itself, is probably the wrong phrase, but has been leaders around this whole notion around future of work and what that looks like. And significant investment, significant innovation, ideation. Sometimes it doesn't work out. 90% of the time it does. But to me, there's this beautiful centerpiece around what does engagement truly need to look like and what should it look like to enable the future of work. Cisco's primary hybrid / remote. And to do that, engagement isn't something that you just send a survey out once a year and people answer 10 questions. And then you say, okay, that's good. We learned this. Now let's move on to the task. It has got to get into the DNA, fundamentally different than what a lot of organizations think. And these EROs and these communities and how they're engaged and the purpose driven around it, those are incredibly important elements, not only for the business outcomes, as Kelly had mentioned too, but to fundamentally rewire what engagement could and should look like in effective and successful companies. And nobody does that better in my mind from what I've come across from Cisco. That's credit to the larger team and the leadership that stayed the course over the last decade, honestly, plus. But there's a learning element for a lot of companies that struggle. And the veterans, ERO communities, however you want to define it, can be a catalyst for that. But it's got to be connected to a larger thing. And that thing, one of the key things on that for me is, what does engagement really need to look like? And how can the veterans community play into that? Because it's different. I mean, today in 2025 is different than it was in 2018, 2019, 2020.
Last question is around mental health, which obviously we put this as one of the last ones to kind of tie this all together, because this podcast just isn't about veterans issues, but around supporting mental health as an issue and how to support this as a leader for your employees. So things like burnout, anxiety, and emotional fatigue is the top of mind for a lot of companies right now. Kelly, if you want to tell us what Cisco is doing to help your leaders recognize when someone might be struggling, and what kind of tools do you give managers to help them lead with empathy?
Yeah. I think all of this really starts with fostering a culture that normalizes mental health discussions. And without doing that, it's very difficult for leaders to recognize struggles that might be happening, like burnout, anxiety, or emotional fatigue that you tend to see. You have to normalize the conversations. It really starts there. And we encourage leaders to regularly check in with their employees about their well-being, but also their colleagues, have their colleagues check in with each other around their well-being. You can notice these things like change in work output, engagement, kind of communication styles. There are things you can notice when someone's starting to display signs of mental health challenges. And something we like to say at Cisco is mental health is not unlike physical health. Everyone has it, and you have to manage it every day. And I think sometimes when we think about mental health, people think about mental illness, and mental health is not necessarily mental illness. Mental health is something we need to manage every day, and it's equally as important as our physical health. But coming off that tangent, when we create this safe space, what it actually does is it allows our employees to feel comfortable discussing when they might be struggling without this stigma or this fear of judgment. So it's about setting the right cultural tone and equipping your leaders with the know-how to do that. And then beyond that, we try to ensure that our leaders are aware of all the programs that we have. Of course, we have a lot of programs in the overall well-being initiative at Cisco that, prioritize things like self-care for loved ones, mindfulness coaching, resilience, health coaching, caregiver support. We try to approach it in a very holistic way that looks at physical health, mental health, financial health. All of these things are really important. And we do some of these through external partnerships. I feel like we're pulling on this thread of the partnerships, but we work with external partners. One of them is Pavelka. They help us with a real focused initiative that is around on kind of 4 health elements. It's eat, sweat, think, and connect. And it's this idea of kind of holistic health. And we bring this into a lot of our teams. It empowers our employees to embed some of these well-being rituals into the workday, because that's the other thing. I find often our leaders are willing, but they're not sure what. And so we partner oftentimes to be able to bring some of these rituals into meetings. And another one that's really popular, I mentioned this one because it's probably one of our most popular, is our mindfulness and resilience training that we have. And we open this up for teams to do together, for leaders to do with their teams. It's like a Cisco mindset that teaches mindfulness based really on cognitive strategies to help improve mental stamina, focus, and adaptability. This is caring for your mental health, which again is equally as important for the physical health. But there are some other things we do around that as well that we try to make sure that our teams know. And this is one of the positive uses of AI that we're seeing at Cisco. We're taking all of our kind of people data repository, and wow, we made it this far without using the 2 words or the 2 letters. I'm really impressed. But we're using AI to kind of bring these things to the fingertips of our leaders and to our teams when they need them, so they understand it. Because we have a crisis of, how do I phrase this? We have a crisis of abundance when it comes to well-being resources. And so being able to get them kind of to the person that needs them in the time in which they need them and in a flexible way. So things like therapy, we have pretty robust support with, free counseling sessions and a dedicated resource site. It can be done live or it can be done virtual. We have different ways to do it. We've got a wealth of programs around neurodivergent support, coaching and training, not just for employees that might have ADHD or autism or other neurodivergences, but for managers who are maybe leading those employees to help kind of foster an inclusive environment. And so we try to get these resources and tools to our leaders so that they have them and they can recognize the moment in which their employees might need them. But at the same time, with AI, we're trying to get them directly to the employees. If an employee doesn't want to discuss this, because the reality is we may have employees that don't want to discuss their mental health with their leader, but would like help. And so it allows us to do that.
Last question is, there's one thing you want other leaders to take away from Cisco's approach to veteran support and employee wellness. What would it be, Kelly?
I think that if you want it to be genuine, it starts with really intentional listening, understanding the unique experience and the needs that you have of your community, kind of going back to this, how you build it. That's probably number one. I think number 2 is around just the value of creating an environment where people feel seen, heard, and empowered. This element and how strongly it is connected to well-being can't be underscored. You mentioned earlier, Steve, we were talking about mission-driven or purpose-driven work. People are asking for that. And so they're also asking to make sure that they're seen in the work that they do. So creating that environment is really important. And I think at the heart of success of any company trying to do that is going to be this commitment that is ongoing to learning and adaptation, where you're kind of regularly seeking feedback and evolving the support that you do to meet the changing needs of people, because we don't live in a static world. Our world is very dynamic. And to Jason's point, it's not a put a listening survey out and call it a day. It's a very dynamic listening ecosystem that you have to deploy and find some great partners. That's the other thing I would say. Nobody needs to go at it alone.
There's a thing called a purpose gap with candidates and employers where they want to get more purpose out of what they do beyond their 9 to 5 job. And it sounds like that's everything you're trying to do is look at this holistically, not just as the job, that you want to give them purpose. You want them to feel safe. You want them to build relationships, make a difference in the organization. And it's very impressive. So thank you for all the great insight. Well, this wraps it up. I really appreciate both of you. Kelly and Jason, thanks for sharing your time and your insights with us today. Exciting for us to launch this together and do more with leaders in this space. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone, and we'll be back with more voices of leadership and impact on the next episode of CEO Connect.